Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the study. In the previous lectures, we have talked about ethics, moral education, and vigilance as some of the fundamental principles of governance. Now, these principles are not unique to the Chinese culture, but should be beneficial to all cultures and political systems, because they are not the outcome of any particular system. Instead, they're based on the nature of man and human relations. So today we're going to explore another aspect of governing principles, which is people as the foundation of governance. Now, we know that the ancient Chinese history is long, and there have been many dynasties, right? Some noble families fell and others rose from the grassroots to the throne. So in order to achieve prolonged prosperity and avoid social disruption, the ancient scholars and kings have tried long and hard to search for the crown jewel of governance. And one doctrine, which has been tested and verified time and time again during the 5,000 years of history, is that people is always the foundation of governance. To put it differently, the people is the object of governance. Throughout the Chinese history, without fail, whenever the ruling body value the people, the country thrive. Whenever the ruling body put themselves before the people, they fail. Mencius has pointed out the relative hierarchy among the different social categories. Now, I use the word social category instead of social class to avoid the risk of being misinterpreted that there is a heterogeneous honor or nobility among the different social categories. Okay? Now, the differences in the social categories mainly come from the nature of the job and the influence. Therefore, there is a heterogeneous importance among the various social categories. Mencius said the people are the most important element, and then the state is the next, and the ruler is the least. This is depicted by the picture on the left-hand side. The word state can be interpreted as the physical existence of the nation, and it must be maintained through economic development, including agricultural activity and other crucial production activities. So what Mencius means is that everything that the government does is for the survival and thrive of the people. The countries is a platform. It's a platform, but it's not yet the final destination of governance. So it would be problematic if the government focuses on the development of the country but ignores the need of the people. Well, you might wonder, how can this be? Isn't country development beneficial to the people? Aren't they the same thing? Well, I'm a social scientist and a finance researcher by training, so I would just give you a very simple example from my area. You see, the development of a state can be measured by GDP, innovation, or foreign direct investment, etc., right? And these are the most commonly used measures when describing the overall performance of a state. But the people who constitute the state may well be concerned with some other measures. For example, are my parents properly taken care of? Can I feed my children? Is my relationship with the partners going well? Am I happy at work? And so on. So these are the real questions that are asked by the people every day. The general measures on the performance of the state are surely related to people's life quality. However, these are not the ultimate target of governance. Mencius said that as compared to the people and the state, the ruler is the least important. Now, it doesn't mean that the ruler is literally negligible. Okay, based on our understanding so far, quite the contrary, the characteristics of the ruler will affect the fate of the nation. But what we mean here is that the object of governance should be the state and the people. In order to shed more light on this hierarchy, Mencius described it in a different way, which is depicted by the picture on the right-hand side there. He said, to maintain the job of an emperor, one must gain the mass of the people. To maintain the job of the feudal prince, one needs to gain the emperor. And finally, to maintain the job of a great official, one needs to gain the feudal prince. So when we use the word gain, it means that one must obtain the support, right? So this put the people at the very top of the ranking of soft authority. Now, please allow me to remind our viewers that this doctrine was formally put forth during the period of feudalism. Okay, it wasn't created by Confucius out of thin air. In Confucius' own word, this doctrine synthesized and summarized the governance experience of past sage kings. So the idea of putting people first is not at all a new concept, and it has been studied and practiced by the ancient Chinese government for thousands of years. Also, this concept is not limited to country governance, but also applicable to private enterprise management, communities and organizations. You see, the concept of the people, right, in the above doctrine, can take various forms. For example, the foundation of a large company is not the management team or the chief executive, but the employees. Although the management team set the overall strategy and direction, it's the employees who turn strategy into action, such as production efficiency, innovation research, sales, customer service, and so on. Without the employees, there is no existence of a company. Now, actually, the concept of the people being the foundation of governance comes from ethical education, which has long influenced the Chinese civilization. More specifically, is a mindset of being vigilant about the well-being of the country and the rest of the world. When someone is vigilant and ethical, he or she must naturally worry about the people. Right? Remember the word worry from the previous lecture, right? So in order to illustrate the methodology of people-based governance, we look at three aspects. Okay, value of the people, guide the people, and educate the people. The last one, educate the people, comes from the principle of reciprocity and forgiveness. Now, before we continue, we must say that some of the content below may seem repetitive, but they are discussed from the perspective of the people. In other words, the ultimate object of the governance. Okay, so first of all, value the people. Now, I guess the first thing that we must understand is, why should the government value the people in the first place? Apart from the obvious ethical reason, the governing principles provide a logical deduction to answer this question. This is, in fact, the argument put forth by Shun. Overall, Shun pointed out that loving the people would enable the leader to attain security, and loving the virtuous ministers will lead to prosperity. If a leader only enjoys his high position and treats the people as inferior class without caring about their livelihood, this leader is likely to undervalue the people. And if he undervalues the people, he may not design policies that benefit the people, even if there are adequate resources to do so. Now, perhaps this seems to be a strange thing to say, but because clearly modern government leaders do not design policy that slaughter the people, right? But not slaughtering doesn't mean that the people aren't given enough attention. In much the same way that we cannot say a parent values his children just because he doesn't starve the children to death. Okay, a parent may be harsh on the children from time to time, sometimes not to the children's liking, but this is for the benefit of the children in the long term, right? This includes asking them to finish up homework, tidy up their rooms, learn to be respectful to other people, or be brave and perseverant, etc. So these are long-term value in proper parenting. Likewise, the government may use its executive power to impose certain limitation on people's activities, but nonetheless benefit them in the long term. And this includes tough financial market regulation, for instance, social behavior regulation on limiting certain consumption, such as addictive drugs, etc. Okay, this is because the government valued the well-being of the people. Now, in contrast, a government may loosen certain policies in an attempt to satisfy people's desire, but these policies result in more problems in the future. One example is, again, financial deregulation. Financial deregulation is always welcomed by financial companies, and a tight regulation always faces resistance. But a blind deregulation, if not managed properly, will lead to serious systematic risk. We have witnessed a few financial crises before, such as 2001 Enron crisis and 2007 global financial crisis. Now, one may argue, right, that the original intention of deregulation is to benefit the people, and a financial crisis is just an unintended consequence. However, valuing the people means that the ruling body should carry out extensive analysis on the impact of the policies on people's well-being. And this doesn't mean that there is no room for error and miscalculation. However, evidence shows that the crisis could have been avoided. If we compare the deregulation between 2001 and 2007, we can see a lot of similarities. Although the underlying is different, with the former being energy derivatives and accounting scandal, and the latter being mortgage derivatives, both crises were driven by the lacking of government control and unethical trading behavior. And what is more, there is only 6 years apart. Only 6 years apart, right? So valuing the people is a very subtle thing, and it requires a lot of careful thinking. According to Shun, if the people do not benefit, it would be unlikely for the government to win the love from the people. Consequently, it receives very little support from the people. And this is based on the principle of reciprocity. You see, the people need to feel that, they are truly valued by the government. The politician can give a marvelous speech, right, and win a few people in the short term, but people care more about the result in the long term. So when people truly value the benefit, they will come round and understand that they are valued by the government. To this point, Shun used an example of national security to demonstrate the consequence of losing support from the people. He said, when the government receives no support, the country would be left defenseless, because no one would be willing to risk his life for a government that doesn't seem to value his life, right? Consequently, when the country is under attack, there is no chance for the country to survive, and there will be nothing left to rule. And this is in sharp contrast with what the ruler enjoys doing, which is ruling, isn't it? So overall, this means that if the ruler only cares about his ruling and not the value of the people, he would eventually end up having nothing to rule. And therefore, it is the people who are the sources of stability. So based on this logic, Shun proposed 3 things to the ruling body. He said, if the ruler wants prosperity and lasting ruling of the country, then he'd better reflect upon his own attitude towards the people. For example, how much do you really value the people? Do you treat them as someone whom you can squeeze a few nice words from? or do you treat them as your loving children? Right? Shun also said that if the ruler wants solidarity and support from the people, then he should reflect upon the administrative ability of the government. And this includes many aspects of the governmental work, of course, from strategic planning to the efficiency of policy execution, the ability to respond to emergency and reducing social conflict, etc. Now, if people can see the result, they will naturally come together and support the people. Finally, if the ruler wants a morally superior nation, right, which is elevation of people's moral standing, then he should recruit virtuous ministers to assist him. Now, because this is so important in the government governing principles, we'll provide more details in section 2 in a few moments. Okay? Now, in fact, in the traditional Chinese culture, the relationship between the ruler and the people are far more natural than we might think. Okay? Xunzi's deduction of the source of stability is based on the natural causality between the ruler and the people. For example, in volume 32 of the Governing Principles, Guanzi pointed out that the ruler can either be viewed as a parent of the people or a stranger. Now, this view is resulted from how the ruler treats the people and is not influenced by deliberate propagation, at least not in the long term. Further, this view leads to different actions of the people when the ruler is in trouble. It says that if the ruler, truly cares for the people, then what happens is that the people view him or her as their parent, and in turn, they will show respect. So when the country is in trouble, or the ruler is in trouble, the people will be willing to stand up and share the burden. This is natural because when the parents are in deep trouble or problem and call upon us for help, we do not hesitate because of the emotional bond. Also because we simply cannot ignore the fact that we owe them our life. Because people are naturally grateful. So when seeing the government as their protector, they will want to share the protector's burden. However, if the ruler despises the people, or if the people feel that they are not being valued, they will view the ruler as a stranger on the street and just disregard them. So when the country or the ruler is in trouble, the people simply will not act. So we can see that there is a mutual force, right, existing between the ruler and the people, and this force should be a supportive one, mutually supportive. This mutual support needs to be generated from the leader's side, and then protected and prolonged. Now, the important question is, how can this mutual support be protected? According to the governing principles, one shortcut is to recruit virtuous ministers and let them assist the leader. So this is our focus of the following section. Now, in order to value the people, the governing principles suggest that the leader should recruit virtuous officials to support the government. Now, the question is, what does valuing the people have to do with recruitment of the virtuous officials? What is the relationship there? Now, earlier we showed our viewers that valuing the people is not as simple as having a good wish. There is action involved. It involves deep and thorough analysis of what the people really need. And sometimes, it's beyond public opinion and public perception of what might be good, such as financial deregulation. The process of thorough analysis is very complex and time-consuming, and it requires accurate information processing, unbiased decision-making, and efficient execution. We know that the leaders are, after all, human beings, and human beings in general are subject to potential biases. These biases include both behavioral bias and informational bias. Therefore, it is absolutely imperative for the leader or ruler to receive adequate assistance from virtuous ministers and officials, right? These officials can act as the eyes and ears of the leader and provide advice and monitor the leader. Now, we emphasize the word virtuous because virtuous people are self-controlled and disciplined because of their self-cultivation. Now, in the next 4 lectures, we'll have more details about the quality of the officials, okay, from a human resource management perspective. Now, we'll discuss 2 specific requirements on a good minister or good official. The first is their governance ability or capability, and the second is their advisory capability. Okay, first of all, governing capability. Now, the reason for recruiting a minister with high governance capability is that the ruler's accountability to the people is realized through these ministers, isn't it? Without the ministers or officials to turn strategy and plan into actions, the leader simply cannot realize his responsibility on his own. The governing principles suggest that governance has a number of statuses according to the quality of governance. The best status is one where the governance is relaxed and effortless. Now, there are 2 points to note here. First of all, the word relaxed and effortless is not the same as perfectly competitive market or the invisible hand theory by Adam Smith. This is not what we're talking about. Secondly, relaxed and effortless is not the same as doing nothing. So what it means is that when the right officials have been recruited for the right position, the appropriate resources have been authorized for the officials to carry out their duties, then the leader is freed from, the small and detailed tasks and can focus on making grand strategy. Everything will be in order, right? Because appropriate tasks are carried out effectively and there is nothing left for the leader to worry about. Very interestingly, the history of the spring and autumn period recorded the change in the life of Duke Huan of Qi before and after he recruited Guanzi as his chief minister. Before the Duke made this appointment, he found governing a state a very stressful task, as you can imagine. He had to deal with every little thing from himself because nobody else was capable enough to share his burden. But after he recruited Guanzi as the chief minister, he found that Guanzi had a very clear vision of what the country needed. He had the right methodology as well. And by the way, Guanzi raised the concept of the 4 anchors in governing a state, which is part of the underpinning ethical principles that we discussed in lecture 1. Okay. Now, so the natural question to ask now is, well, how can the leader obtain capable ministers? Well, this is the focus of lecture 7, 8, and 9, but we're very tempting to raise a couple of points here. Surely, appropriate recruitment involves a rigorous process of examination and selection, right? But we want to emphasize on the importance of the leader's mentality about capable ministers and the effect on recruitment. The governing principles always say that the leader must have a complete sincerity of craving for talents. He or she must want them. Okay, these are very strong words if you think about it. The truly virtuous people don't work for the leader only for the money. They mostly work because of their ambition to serve the public. They want to turn their ability and talent into the greater good of the people. So without proper respect and sincerity, virtuous people simply don't work for the leader, because they're not valued and therefore they're not motivated. Right? So that's the first thing. Now, secondly, the leader must give complete trust to the virtuous and talented officials. Now, the reason is twofold. Okay, first of all, without complete trust, the officials simply cannot release their full potential, and it is an impediment to the efficiency of government work. Secondly, people simply like to be trusted, right? Because virtuous people don't work for the money alone, but for a higher level of ambition. If they don't receive proper trust, they will see this as disrespect, and they will likely leave. So we say that for a leader to obtain capable officials or virtuous ministers, he has to show complete trust. Sometimes he has to show this quite deliberately, just to avoid misunderstanding. Here we have a very interesting story again about Guanzi. We know that during the spring and autumn period, China was not a unified country, but was consisted of many small independent states. Before Guanzi became the chief minister of the state of Qi, he used to serve a different leader, okay, and he was the political opponent of the Duke Huan of Qi, actually. But because of his great talent and capability, he was recommended to Duke Huan to help him govern the state of Qi. Now, of course, at the beginning, Duke Huan was very skeptical about this proposal, for very good reason, as you can imagine, right? But the Duke was, more eager to recruit talented officials, and he also understood that Guanzi was simply fulfilling his loyal duty under a different leader. So Duke Huan eventually decided to let go of his doubt and gave Guanzi enormous authority to realize his plan. And apparently this led the state of Qi to become one of the most successful countries during the spring and autumn period. So that was the first requirement, okay, governing capability. The second requirement on a good minister is the advisory capability. So this means that a virtuous minister should be able to provide a good advice to the leader at a timely manner which benefit the people. Now, we have mentioned that sometimes the leader may suffer from informational and behavioral bias, right, which lead to suboptimal decision making. Now, in practice, the leader is simply far away from the common people, right? And as time goes by, he may forget to be fearful of the people because they don't see them, right? In other words, the leader may lose the sense of vigilance. In contrast, the officials and ministers are closer to the common people, and they may be more aware of the potential problems in the society. So it is necessary for the ministers to advise the leader on these problems and maintain the level of vigilance of the government. The ancient sages, kings were, well known for their mindset about the people. For example, when King Wu of Zhou dynasty, consulted his strategies about the past kings and their governance, his strategies emphasized on the mindset of these kings. He said, when Emperor Huang was leading the people, he was constantly fearful, as if night wouldn't turn to morning. When Emperor Yao was leading the country, he was extremely apprehensive, as if he was standing on the brink of a deep abyss. When Emperor Shun was leading the people, he was extremely cautious, as if he was treading on very thin ice, and so on. And so we can see that if there's one thing that the sages kings were different from us, it is that they were constantly vigilant about losing the support from the people, and their governance was driven by this constant fear. So this is why the leader of a country should be reminded about this fear, if you like, in order to avoid mistakes. Now, Guanzi also raised a very good point in his conversation with the Duke Huan of Qi. He said that in order to govern the people well, the leader should give enough attention to the basics, instead of focusing on the grand ambition alone. So his point is that sometimes, the leader could be too ambitious to notice the basic, and consequently ignore the need of the people. Not on purpose, though, but equally devastating. During the Tang dynasty, Emperor Taizong also reminded his son, obviously the future emperor after him, about the importance of self-cultivation as a leader. This is because the leader is in such a position that he can hardly find somebody to remind him about his problem. So this shows the importance to recruit ministers who can give timely and appropriate advice to the leader, right? To bring their attention back to the real need of the people and avoid the pitfall of only focusing on the grand idea. In other words, the honor of the minister is the honor of the leader. They are one. They're not two. Now, in the following chapter, Guiding the People, we'll explore the second aspect of government, treating the people as a foundation, and that is guiding the people. Okay? So, guiding the people can be a very broad topic. Okay, so we approach this topic from the perspective of the evolution of the governing methodology throughout the ancient Chinese history. And we'll show our viewers how the sages rulers guide the people based on the ever-changing characteristics of the society. Now, generally speaking, there are 5 main methods of governance. Okay, 5 main methods. Now, at any point in time, the method is always some kind of a mixture that involves all of them. But the emphasis or the weight allocation is different depending on the concurrent social status. So, based on the governing principles, the most advanced governing method is one based on the principle. The principle. Now, in Chinese language, principle is called Dao. Dao. And it means the way things are. It means a natural order. So at the beginning, people understand the natural order of things. And there is, very little need to tell people what is right or what is wrong. And there is, very little need of regulation. Let's take a parent-children relationship as an example, right? The natural order between the parents and the children is that the parents love the children, protect them, and educate them. Meanwhile, the children have natural love towards the parents and take care of them when they get old and respect them. And the principle is love, right? This love is not something that you have to learn from a teacher. It's quite natural, isn't it? It's natural love. So this is the Tao in this aspect, right? In fact, you can't teach this anyway. Also, this love between parents and children exists between people in general as well. For example, if you pay attention to the way that an infant looks at people, the infant has no awareness of who the person is. It could be the parent or anybody. But there is natural kindness in the eyes of the infant. So when you approach the infant, if you have a chance, please do. When you approach the infant, he or she smiles and responds very naturally, right? So this kindness is love. And obviously, it is not taught. So if the good principles prevail among the people, then people naturally love each other. So this is the highest level of governance and society. Now, when the natural principle becomes unclear, it becomes necessary to mention virtue, right? This is because when the natural principles are at work, there is no need to mention virtue. The word itself is meaningless. Virtue is, as opposed to unvirtuous, right? Virtuous as opposed to unvirtuous. So if everybody naturally lives in a virtuous way and has no idea about an unvirtuous way of living, then the word itself is redundant. Virtue is also the natural way of doing things. And the natural way is always the good way, because it causes no harm. Although this time round, people sometimes have to be reminded about virtue. Having to rely on virtue is also very advanced, in fact. Okay, this is because the people or the society understand virtue. Otherwise, you can't remind them, right? They must understand. And they also crave for virtue. They just forget sometimes. So in this case, the government can easily influence the people with high standard virtue of its own, and the people will be drawn to the government. And this mechanism is like a magnet, right? Attracting a piece of iron. Easily done. Easily done. Now, when the general society start to pay less attention to virtue, but people still have a good heart, then the governing method tilts towards benevolence. As you remember, in Chinese writing, the character benevolence specifically depicts a picture of two persons, right? Two persons. And it basically means that when a person does something, he doesn't only think about himself, but also other people. And the real life manifestation is that if there is something that you don't want to be done to you, you also don't do it to other people. So in this scenario, people can still, greatly improve and cultivate themselves when they are exposed to benevolent behavior and teaching. People can still care about other people because they still have a benevolent heart. Now, the next level is a situation where people are less motivated to pursue benevolence or self-cultivate. However, people still have a strong sense of justice and righteousness. And righteousness is about what is right and what is wrong, right? So it's a more deliberate action. Now let's use filial piety as an example to explain this. You see, filial piety has different levels, right? The highest level is where people continue the natural love between parents and an infant and through their life and wholeheartedly serve their parents. A lower level is where people think about the kindness of their parents and they want to repay them with love and kindness. This is still very good. I should say very, very good, right? But they have to think about it. The next level below that is where people recognize that taking care of the parents is the right thing to do. And this is righteousness. It is immoral not to do so. So in this case, people are driven by their conscience. Some people may have to mentally struggle for a little while. Should I take care of my parents? Should I leave them? But people finally come round and do the right thing. So at this level, the most effective governance is one based on the advocation of righteousness, because people respond to righteousness. Now, when the concept of righteousness starts to fade away and the government will have to teach people using propriety. If you remember, propriety is social code of conduct and behavior, right? and the government have to use propriety because it becomes inefficient to expect people to do the right thing based on conscience and righteousness. For example, bowing. Bowing is propriety. So adhering to the appropriate dress code for different occasions is also propriety. Giving seat to disabled people on the bus is propriety, etc. Now, although a society with propriety is much better than one without it, we can clearly see that it is not as good as a society where people naturally behave out of pure benevolence or virtue. Well, however, in this type of society, propriety still works because people understand the benefit of good behavior and are willing to adhere to the code of conduct. Now, moving on, the next level of the society is one where, propriety is completely abandoned and the people only care about private benefit and compete with each other without a moral compass. Well, what kind of society would that be? Well, it's certainly not a very good one, right? To be precise, it's a horrible society to live in. So all in all, we can clearly see that there is a dropping level of advancement of the society from principle-based governance to virtue-based governance to benevolent-based, righteousness-based, and propriety-based. Now, we must say, the change in governance style is not a rocket science. Also, the level of advancement has absolutely nothing to do with the level of technology, because technology doesn't make the mind more virtuous. You see? So people with a virtuous mindset can create technology that helps people without any downside. But people without a moral compass may use the same technology to destroy people's life. Now, according to the history record, the different style of governments have been practiced through various periods of history. Now, for example, during the period of the three sages kings, the ruling body ruled the country largely based on principles, and the governance achieved the level of effortless, right, relaxed governance, where the people, naturally practice virtue. So the ruling was natural. Then during the period of the Emperor Yao, Shun, and Yu, the society was largely governed based on virtue, and to be more precise, the virtue of the government. Compare with the previous period, people's mindsets started to lose stability. As we said before, the natural principle became blurred, and it was difficult to govern naturally. However, it was still very efficient and very effective for the rulers to govern using their own virtue, and people responded very well. It has been recorded that Emperor Yao and Emperor Yu always blamed themselves for the misfortune of the people. And when they saw criminals being punished, they felt that it was because their virtue was so weak and inferior that they couldn't influence the people. The governing principle recorded that it says, Yao's kindness and benevolence became apparent. He also set the trend in upholding righteousness. His virtue was so far-reaching and extensive that people encouraged each other to do good things without expecting any reward. And the government was able to govern without using penalties to punish the people. So we can see that people during this period were largely guided by virtues of the leaders, and they were longing for virtue. During the later part of Xia dynasty, and as well as Shang and Zhou dynasty, most of the rulers applied what is called the parental mentality. Okay, and they treated the people as their own children, and governed the country with benevolence. In the book of Xin Xu, it is recorded that once during the government's construction work, King Wen of Zhou discovered some human bones buried under the construction site. Okay. Now, upon this discovery, King Wen ordered a formal funeral to be held for the person that the bones belonged to. Okay. And the official said to King Wen, "We don't know whom these bones belong to, sir." But King Wen's replied to the officials, "Well, those who govern the country are the lords of the country and the people. Whoever these bones belong to, this is my people." So after that, the king put the bones in a coffin and held a funeral to bury it properly. Now, when people heard about this, they were very moved by the benevolent heart of King Wen. They said, if the king is so kind to the dignity of a dead man that he doesn't know, well, he must be also kind to the people. And indeed, the history shows that King Wen was a very benevolent and virtuous king with great sense of sympathy, and people from the neighboring states came to him and submitted to him, all because of the influence of his moral superiority. Now the history moves on to the spring and autumn and warring state period. Okay, so in these periods, virtue gradually lost its root, and it became difficult to govern solely based on natural realization of virtue. But even so, the leaders of many states could still maintain some degree of righteousness. They can still govern based on the pursuit of what is right and what is normally morally reasonable. Now here we have a very good example of what righteousness means in governance. This comes from the conversation between one of Confucius' student Gong and the governor called Zang Sun. Okay. So Zang Sun was a very capable governor. He was very capable, but his governing style showed no mercy, and in fact he was rather cruel in using his power. So Gong blamed him for his governing style. He said, "You are very good at taking action according to the law and punishing the criminals. However, it seems that you also enjoy seeing the criminals being punished. This is not the right mentality, and certainly not the right heart of righteousness, because that is not morally reasonable." Gong also said that you can act with integrity when using public funding, which is Zang Sun, right? So Zang Sun is able to use public funding with integrity, but you do not corrupt. That's very good. But you are very proud of this and appear quite arrogantly in front of your leader. I must admit that you are also very talented in administrative work, but it seems that you take yourself quite seriously and show off your talent in front of your subordinates. Now, Gong explained that those behavior, which is mentioned, right? Those behaviors of Zang Sun, although they didn't break any law, they were not righteous. Regarding punishing the criminals, he said, political management is similar to managing a bowl, a bowl, right? A bowl. You have to maintain the intensity at the right level. You can't be too cruel, neither too soft. So a good government official must not only have technical capability, but should also be guided by moral quality. He must adjust the intensity of his policy based on the characteristics of the territory that he governs. And more importantly, he should govern the people as his own children. This means that he shouldn't be happy when he punishes the criminals. Instead, he should feel regretful for having to do this, and should help the criminals to make a change and live a better life. That is righteousness. Now, in order to illustrate the righteous governance in more detail. Gong used the example of Zichan. Okay, Zichan. I know there's a lot of names, so I hope you don't get confused by these names. Now, Zichan was a statesman of the state of Zheng during the spring and autumn period, before Confucius' time. Okay, and he served as the prime minister from 554 BC until he died in 522 BC. Zichan was well known for his application of righteous-based governance. Very different from Zang Sun. His use of law and regulation depended on the characteristics of the people's mentality. So it's flexible. So when people were, generally moral and could self-cultivate, the law tended to be loose. But when people became careless and despised the law and order, regulation tended to be stringent. And Zichan explained this, that it is like the difference between fire and water. They tend to self-regulate, and stay away from the fire. So very few people die in fire, actually. In contrast, however, water seems harmless, and people expose themselves in deep water. So we may find more people drowning in water than, dying in fire. And so for this reason, the law needs to respond to the changing, to the change in people's mentality. Gong said that under Zichan's governing, when the verdict of the law was undecisive, so if it was about a reward, then the reward tended to be heavy. In contrast, if it was about punishment, then the punishment tended to be light. Now, what's the purpose of that? Well, this is for the purpose of motivating people to do good things and feel shameful of doing bad things. Now, there are many details about Zichan's governing method, but we can't talk about all of them in this lecture. I think in the future, if possible, we can have a dedicated session to study Zichan's governing method and discuss the pros and cons of his policies. Okay, but anyway, overall, Zichan's governing was very successful. And in fact, during his governance, the society became peaceful and punishment ended up being rarely used. Right? So from here, we can clearly see the importance of applying righteousness when using law and regulation. Now, before moving on to the next session, okay, I would just like to draw your attention to another aspect of righteous governance, and that is standing in the shoes of the people. This is another way of applying the concept of righteousness in governance. The governing principle recorded a conversation between King Jing of Qi, the state of Qi, and Yanzi. Okay, now here's the story. So one day, during the winter, it was snowing very heavily, and the king sat down on the porch of the palace in his fur coat and said to Yanzi, "It's not very cold, is it?" Now, upon hearing the king's comment about the weather, Yanzi used this as an opportunity to educate the king, and he said the following: "While the ancient sage rulers had sufficient food to eat, they would remember people who were starving. When they had adequate clothing, they would remember people who were freezing in the cold. While they lived in comfort, they would remember many people who were toiling hard in the world." Well, luckily, King Jing of Qi was a humble ruler, so he, perceived the deep meaning of Yanzi's comment and subsequently initiated a series of economic policy to combat poverty. Now, I hope that we don't treat this story lightly and think that how can a king not know about the weather? But, sometimes people do forget about their situation and lose common sense. even the ruler. So if a ruler doesn't investigate the life of the common people or the grassroots people, he may take certain condition as given. For example, if we ask a prime minister right now, to describe a typical day of a homeless person, I doubt that he or she would be able to give an accurate account. Being righteous means doing the right thing. So to do this, the ruling body must be able to stand in the shoes of the people. This is in fact similar to the relationship between a parent and a child, right? When a parent thinks for the child, he or she would naturally think very thoroughly. Okay. Now the final aspect of treating the people as the basis of governance is to govern with mercy. Now, mercy can be interpreted as a kind of mentality as well, okay? And it is the mentality when dealing with other people. And it's especially important when it comes to governance, because having merciful heart can hugely influence the overall ethical standard of the society. Now, one way to apply mercy in governance is to achieve a good balance between education and punishment. Now, some of our viewers may recall from Lecture 2 where we talked about education as the foundation of governance. But in this chapter, we try to shed some light on the importance of ethical education from a legal perspective in order to solidify the position of education in governance. So, the governing principle reminds us that when making a decision to execute punishment, the ruling body must ask themselves a question, which is, have the people been properly educated? In other words, are people aware of morality and law? If they do, and they still decide to break the law on purpose, then it is reasonable to punish in order to show justice and deter future crime. For example, I suppose almost everyone knows that we should pay income tax. It's a responsibility to pay tax, and it is law to pay tax. So if you avoid paying tax while enjoying the full benefit of government public spending, then you are not fulfilling your responsibility as a citizen, and of course you're breaking the law. And there is no complaint when you're caught and punished. However, if you genuinely don't know about the law and you're punished, then somehow this is cruelty. Why? Well, Confucius used the example of filial piety to explain this. He said, it is not right for a ruler who has deviated from the righteous way of leadership to put his officials and subject to death. Even though the people are not being taught the way of filial piety and the proper behavior that goes along with it, they're being convicted and put into prisons. To do so amounts to killing the innocent. Well, let me explain this, okay? I think this deserves some explanation. We have established that the filial piety is not a man-made rule, okay? It's part of nature. The love between parents and the children is so natural that we shouldn't even have to mention the concept of filial piety in the first place. Many people carry out their filial duty very well and they barely mention it because it is a natural thing to do. However, there are indeed some people who need a bit of a reminder and explanations why they should be filial to their parents. Well, in this case, we have to mention the obvious, right? For example, the parents gave us life, knowledge, and protect us. It is a job that runs 24/7 with no salary and reward. If a friend helps you, you would be very grateful and would want to repay their debt somehow. This is the same with the parents. But because the parents have been with us from the beginning, we tend to forget and take their kindness as given. And this is why we see a lot of people, who are very good with their friends and and colleagues, but very impatient and sometimes extremely rude with their parents, breaking the parents' heart. In ancient China, an unfilial child would be punished by law. So in this case, Confucius raised the necessity to educate the people about filial piety before punishment. People need to understand the rationale of filial piety. If they simply don't know, then it seems unproductive to punish them. Now, apart from filial piety, can we think of any other example where education should precede punishment? Any example? Well, let me tell you one of the biggest failure of our modern higher education, okay? And that is financial ethics education. I can talk about this all day, every day. But I just like to mention to our viewers one thing. In modern financial education, the curriculum, teaching, and exams mostly focus on the technical part of finance, such as calculation, financial engineering, statistics, valuation, trading strategy, etc. Okay? However, there is very little emphasis on the purpose of finance. What is the purpose of finance? Well, it's a service, financial service, isn't it? It's for the purpose to provide matching, for example, between those who need funding and those who have surplus capital, as one of the services. Now, if we look at the financial crisis in the past few decades, many financial service companies don't do any of that. They cannot evaluate the product they have created. They trade against their clients. They exploit regulation loopholes. And the only thing that motivates people to come to the office is to make as much money as possible and as quickly as they can. Well, look, there is nothing wrong with making money itself, but it becomes a crime if the money is made at the expense of market integrity and the well-being of ordinary people. But the problem is, many convicted financial experts thought that they were doing the right thing. They didn't know. They thought they were fulfilling the responsibility as a trader, right? Which is making money and making money alone. None of them is a criminal type, or at least most of them, right? They love their families. They provide for their families. They support their parents. They send kids to school. They donate to community charities. They're just ordinary people. But they don't know that they are destroying life through their trading of toxic financial products, because they're not trained to consider the bigger picture of the society in general and the long-term effect on people's well-being. So for this reason, as compared to punishment, adequate financial ethics education is in order before punishment. Confucius also used the example of soldiers to criticize overly strict law that takes no account of human nature. He cast the question, should the soldiers be punished as they are defeated on the battlefield? Apparently, punishing a soldier simply based on the outcome of the battle is cruel. Confucius revealed that one unintended consequence of inadequate education is the increasing crime rate with law and regulation being created. So more law, more crime. This is because people don't think about their behavior from an ethical perspective. And they find dodging law and exploiting loopholes an honorable thing to do, a clever thing to do. So, what does Confucius think? Well, Confucius accepted that punishments are necessary, but shouldn't be used in three cases. The first case reflects our earlier discussion where there is inadequate moral education. Okay, so we won't repeat it now. Now, the second case is when the law is insufficient and loose. So if the law doesn't say you cannot do something, then you should not be punished for doing so. And this is the simplest case, right? This is the simplest case that we use law as the minimum behavioral standard. The minimum behavioral standard. But we know that people are very good at dodging laws, right? So solely relying on law and regulation doesn't solve the problem. The third case is where ruling is unreasonable and cruel. And this suggestion put the regulator and the ruling body under tight scrutiny. For example, it's probably unreasonable to punish people for not paying taxes if the tax is 90%, right? Which makes it very difficult for people to live. In Volume 10, the governing principles document the sequence of governance, which put education and punishment in a more systematic order. It says that first of all, before ethical education, the ruling body should self-cultivate first. The leaders should improve their own understanding, of morality and ethics, and change their own behavior. This is called demonstration by doing. And as you may recall, demonstration by doing is a very powerful way of educating the people according to ancient Chinese philosophy. This is not only applied to family education, school education, but also to country education, country governance as well. So by observing the leader of the country, right, pursuing an ethical way of life, the people will naturally long for morality and will be motivated to self-cultivate. Sometimes social conflict may be so severe and the doubt about ethics is so deep that the leader's demonstration only leads to limited social effect. This doesn't mean that top-level demonstration is not working, but only that more motivational method should be adopted. So in this case, certain policies should be designed to reward the morally superior citizens. So this makes the benefits of moral superiority more visible. Although we say that people should practice morality for morality's sake, but it doesn't hurt to give a little boost by monetizing morality for a good purpose. This is similar to a situation where young children are rewarded with small present like a candy for helping people, because this action will remind the children that helping people is a desirable virtue. Now, rewarding morality is a policy that focuses on the positive side of social behavior. If this doesn't work, it may mean that social immorality has been rooted so deeply in people's mind that the people simply cannot change their behavior easily. And more specifically, people may find it beneficial to practice immorality in the short term. This is a very common behavior in certain business conduct, such as inappropriate competitive practice, certain pricing policy, or low quality of the product, etc. In these cases, people are unable to see the long-term benefit of morality. So when this happens, the policy will may have to focus more on the negative side and raise awareness and attention about immorality. So this could include the use of public warning, temporary restriction on business trading, and so on. Hopefully, crimes will be largely reduced at this point, and the people are able to self-discipline. And finally, if there are still some rigid bad apples, the last resort would be to use punishment by law. So we can see that, the first and foremost mechanism of governance is still education, and punishment is kept to a minimum. And the benefit of the sequence is that the government can strengthen the persistency of morality to its maximum, while reducing the negative consequence of punishment to a minimum. If the situation or the sequence is reversed, let's say, according to the governing principle, the society may end up with more crimes. Now, although we understand, the physical mechanism of the above sequence of education first, we should mention the theoretical support in order to strengthen our faith in this sequence. Okay. Now, the fundamental driver of education preceding regulation and mercy to people is that human beings are naturally good. This is the theoretical support. But what went wrong is the habit, not the nature. Habit of immorality can make a good person shameless. And without shamefulness, there is nothing that a person would not do. Therefore, one way to see education is that it helps people to reclaim the sense of shamefulness. In a society which only, emphasize on punishment without education, people will find it provocative, and it could make a superior person mean. In the governing principle, there is an interesting story about the government official called Ji Gao. Okay, Ji Gao worked as a warden of a prison in the state of Wei. Okay, so he was a warden, and once he had to punish a prisoner by cutting off his feet. Not long after that, a civil war broke out in the state of Wei. So one day, Ji Gao was being chased by some soldiers, and so he was running, right? And when he when he reached the city wall and had nowhere to escape, the guard on the city wall helped him to hide in a room and managed to survive. Now, to Ji Gao's surprise, the guard was in fact the prisoner that he punished when he was the warden. So he said to the guard, well, back then I cut off your feet because I couldn't disobey the law. And today you had a perfect reason to avenge yourself. But you saved my life instead. Why did you do that? The guard replied to Ji Gao, you cut off my feet because I broke the law, and there was nothing you could do about it. When hearing my case, you always delayed my execution because you were trying to obtain a remission for me. I could see that. And when you had to execute the punishment, you were very sad and very reluctant. I could see that as well. And when you fulfilled your duty and executed, you didn't do it with joy, but with sympathy. So this is why I admire you and help you today. In fact, Ji Gao was one of Confucius' students. And this story is I think, is very meaningful for us, right? In understanding the significance of mercy and the effect of education, in particular ethical education, on people's mentality. Having mercy on people means that when there is a choice between moral education and legal punishment, it is usually better to adopt the former, which is moral education. So this way, people can be changed from within and generate a high persistency in pursuing an ethical way of life. This concludes Lecture 4. Thank you.